Hey, Shalom, Shalom. First and foremost, I'm say call halal, Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shah, Bahashem, Rakah HaKodash. I want to send double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone. I want to send much peace, love, and salutations to you, brothers and sisters out there pushing the word of Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shah, and sincerely in truth. This is Brother Ariella. And we're going to do another story of victory in the scripture. And today, what we're going to focus on is the story of Purim, one of my favorite stories. This is the time of the Persian captivity. Where you had Mordecai and Esther, who were two Israelites, two Jews that were in the king's court, but amongst them was an Edomite by the name of Haman, who they had built up some popularity with the Persians at this period of time, even though the Edomites were an enemy, the Macedonians anyway, but Haman was able to get up into the king's court and basically determined and it was in the ear of the king that the Jews were a problem and that they needed to get rid of them. And so it's a really good story of victory. We're going to go into the book of Esther, the 4th chapter, and read that. And Lord willing, this is just a good listen and edifying. All right, so before we get started, I just wanted to get a brief overview. This is in the Britannica.com. When you look up Purim, it says in the English, a feast of lots. That's what the word Purim means, lots, okay? It says a joyous Jewish festival commemorating the survival of the Jews who, in the 5th century BCE, were marked for death by their Persian rulers. The story is related in the biblical book of Esther. Haman, chief minister of King Ahasuerus, incensed that Mordecai, a Jew, held him in disdain and refused obeisance, because Mordecai, he didn't bow down to no damn Edomite. He wasn't going to bow down to Haman, because he only bows to the Most High, right? He refused obeisance, meaning to bow down. It says that Haman was convinced the king that the Jews living under Persian rule were rebellious and should be slaughtered. With the king's consent, Haman set a date for the execution, the 13th day of the month of Adar, by casting lots and built gallows for Mordecai. So they cast lots and it fell on this particular day for Mordecai to be hung and basically for them to run through all the different towns and provinces and kill all the Jews. Okay? It says, when word of the planned massacre reached Esther, beloved Jewish queen of Ahasuerus, and adopted daughter of Mordecai, she risked her life by going uninvited to the king to suggest a banquet that Haman would attend. Okay? And so let's go into the scriptures and read about that account. So this is the book of Esther, the 4th chapter. I'm reading it in the NLT. I'm going to start at the top. It says, when Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes. He rent his clothes. He tore his clothes. He put on burlap and ashes. He put on sackcloth and went out into the city crying with a loud and bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as the news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. When Queen Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was in mourning. And so, when you were a king, you had eunuchs that you would use to attend to your wives or concubines. A eunuch is a person that doesn't lay with women. A lot of times, in some of these cases, they actually had their rod taken off. That way, there was no chance for their woman to deal with that man. Okay, so that's what the word eunuch means. It basically means a chief officer, like Daniel was a eunuch. Okay, but he didn't have his rod chopped off. It's an interchangeable word for like a chamberlain, officer, or it could actually be a person that does not deal with a woman. But in these cases, usually it's a chief attendant to the king. Okay, so it says she ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was mourning. So Hatak went out to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hatak a copy of the decree issued in Susa and that called for the death of all the Jews. He asked Hatak to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hatak to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hatak returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hatak to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. The king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hatak gave Esther's message to Mordecai. So back in the ancient world, even as a queen, you couldn't just pull up on the king unless you were called to come. Unless you 30 days. I'll see you in 30 days. You can't just sneak up on my crib. You can't FaceTime me. You got a deal, you know. This is how it was in the ancient world. Or you came unannounced into the king, what happened? You get put to death. So it wasn't no games. So Mordecai is basically asking her to put herself in a position where she could get put to death. Okay? For the sake of the rest of the Jews. Okay? This is verse 13. It says, Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? So this is why I always tell people this book could have been called the Book of Mordecai because it's such a pivotal piece in this story for the mindset of young Esther, who was put in a position that's scary. Okay, very, very scary situation for Esther to be in, but for the whole nation to have this threat is crazy, right? It says, then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. So they went on a dry fast, all right, for 3 days. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So that's extreme bravery that we're seeing from Esther. Okay? It says, so Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. All right? Let's go to the next chapter. This is chapter 5. It says, on the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out his gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Then the king asked her, what do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom. So you know he really liked Esther. For her to pull up like that and have that much effect on him, she had to be a baddie. Right? You know, humble, everything a man is looking for. Okay? It says, and Esther replied, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king. The king turned to the attendants and said, tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet, as Esther has requested. So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. While they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, now tell me what you really want. What is your request? And I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom. Esther replied, this is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and to do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet. I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about. Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet, But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. Then Haman gathered together his friends as Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the nobles and officials. Then Haman added, "And that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to a banquet she prepared for us, and she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow." Then he added, "But this is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting there at the palace gate." So more importantly than all that, I want Mordecai out of there. That's how much hate he had. So Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends suggested set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. Then, when this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up. All right, so strict death is what Haman wanted, right? Verse 6. Verse 6, it says, "That night the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him." In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. "What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this?" the king asked. His attendants replied, "Nothing has been done for him." So that's the spirit that's the spirit that the Most High put it to where he couldn't sleep and to go into that particular record and account and read it. So they say the Most High is in control. It says, "Who is that in the outer court?" the king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived at the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. So the attendants replied to the king, "Haman is out in the court. Bring him in," the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, "What should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me?" Haman thought to himself, "Whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" So he replied, "If the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, 'This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor.'" "Excellent," the king said to Haman. "Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested." So Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. Then Haman told his wife Zeresh and all of his friends what had happened. His wise advisors and his wife said, "Since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him." While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. All right, moving on to the next chapter. Chapter 7, verse 1 says, "So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, 'Tell me what you want.' 'Queen Esther, what is your request? I'll give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom.' Queen Esther replied, 'If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I would remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. Who would do such a thing? King Xerxes demanded. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? Esther replied, This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Like, oh, snap. Can you imagine being there and have that come out? It says, Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining. Just as the king was returning from the palace garden, the king exclaimed, will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes? And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. Then impale Haman on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Gotcha, bitch. So yeah, you got put to death right there on the spot, man. Chapter 8, verse 1 says, On the same day King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther, took his crib, everything. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. Then Esther went again before the king, falling down at his feet and begging him with tears to stop the evil plot devised by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. Again, the king held out his gold scepter to Esther, so she rose and stood before him. Esther said, If it please the king, and if we have found favor with him, and if he thinks it is right, and if I am pleasing to him, let there be a decree that reverses the orders of Haman's son of Hammedatha the Agagite, who ordered that Jews throughout all the king's provinces should be destroyed. For how can I endure to see my people and my family slaughtered and destroyed? Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, I have given Esther the property of Haman, and he has been impaled on a pole because he tried to destroy the Jews. Now go ahead and send a message to the Jews in the king's name, telling them whatever you want, and seal it with the king's signet ring. But remember that whatever has already been written in the king's name and sealed with the signet ring can never be revoked. So on June 25th, right, June 25th, these people are crazy. All right, the month of Adar. The king's secretaries were summoned, and the decree was written exactly as Mordecai dictated. And it was not no June. There's no June in the scripture. This is the NLT translation, so they etemized it right there. Okay, it says it was written exactly as Mordecai dictated. It was sent to the Jews and to the highest officers, the governors and the nobles of all the 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. The decree was written in the scripts and languages of all the peoples of the empire, including that of the Jews. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Mordecai sent the dispatches by swift messengers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king's service. The king's decrees gave the Jews in every city authority to unite and defend their lives. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who might attack them or their children and wives, and to take the property of their enemies. The day chosen for this event throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes was in, I guess, the third year. And then next year I'm going to go to the actual translation, so it's clear. Boom, boom. 8 and 10 in the King James Version. It says, And he wrote in King Xerxes Ahasuerus' name and sealed it with the king's ring and sent letters by post on horseback and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews that were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil for them for a prey. Upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, right? It says the copy of the writing for this commandment, for this commandment to be given in every province, was published unto all people, and that the Jews will be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan or Shusha, like we read earlier, the palace. It says, and Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in the royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad, and the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. So you got proselytes, people who were just like, look, we going with them. The king is with them, so we with them. But they had basically had that blessing, you know. And so this is where you get that day Purim. Okay? Now, check this out. In chapter 9, I'm going to read through it too. Chapter 9 says, now, in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution. In the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in the cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and the officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan, the palace of the Jews, slew and destroyed 500 men. All right, and Parshadatha, and Dalphon, and Aspatha, and Paratha, and Adalia, and Aridatha, and Parmashta, and Arishai, and Aridai, and Vajezatha, the sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they. But on the spoil laid they not their hands. So all his posterity was taken out. Okay? It says, on that day, the number of those that were slain in Shushan, the palace, was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. Or what is thy request further? And it shall be done. Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according to this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it to be done. So Esther had a little gangster in her, you know. It says, and the decree was given at Shushan that they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month of Adar, and slew 300 men of Shushan. But on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies and slew their foes 70,000. But they laid not their hands on the prey. So throughout all the other provinces, Jake was getting it in, 75,000, right? People. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested day, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were in Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same day they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. Okay? And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same yearly. Okay, as the days when the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning to a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions to one another and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had despised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is, the lot, all right, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that this wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the name of Purim. Therefore, for all the words of this letter and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, as so as it should not fail, that they would keep those 2 days according to their writings and according to their appointed time every year. It says, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim shall not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. All right, so they made it a holy decree. Made it to where that 14th day, the 13th, 14th day, they just party. All right, send gifts to one another, take care of the poor, have a festival. Right? It says, then Esther the queen and the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. Okay? He sent the letters unto all the Jews to 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth to confirm these days of Purim in their appointed time, according to Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matter of the fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it is written in the book. And it was written in the book. So, man, with that, man, call hello Yahweh Ba'Hashem, Yahweh Shah Ba'Hashem Kodash. You can go and study Purim, as you wish, man. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone. Much peace, love, salutations to all of you out there pushing the word Yahweh Ba'Hashem, Yahweh Shah, in sincerity and truth, man. Shalom.